Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So we have the second lecture in this module of inelastic neutron scattering and quasi-elastic neutron scattering. Let's quickly revise what we did in the previous lecture. So essentially, in neutron scattering, we monitor three parameters: the energy, wave vector, and the polarization of the neutron. So these are the incoming values of for the incoming neutron. After scattering from the sample, these are denoted by, again, energy, wave vector, and the polarization. And these changes are what we monitor. For the case of diffraction, because you do not do any energy analysis of the scattered neutron beam, you just assume that the magnitude of the wave vector kf is equal to that of the incident neutron, and the change in the wave vector is denoted by q, and if this is equal to a reciprocal lattice vector, then the break condition is satisfied. Okay. However, when we do inelastic neutron scattering, we do energy analysis of the scattered neutron beam, and then we can write down the change in neutron energy and the change in the wave vector, or the so-called wave vector transfer, and these are the quantities that those are relevant. Okay, the scattering cross-section now is a function of four variables. Three variables of the solid angle in which the neutron is scattered. So this essentially gives the probability that an incident neutron is scattered by the sample into a solid angle d omega around omega, and with energy transfer dE around E. Okay, so and this scattering cross-section is directly proportional to what we call the dynamical structure factor. So the dynamical structure factor is a function of four variables, three wave vectors and three components of the wave vector and the energy transfer. And this has essentially the information about the solid or the system that we are planning to study. Okay. Then we also said that the inelastic scattering could have two components. Due to the periodic dynamics, inelastic scattering, where the energy transfer has distinct values, or from the quasi-elastic scattering, where what we have is a Lorentzian spectrum centered around the zero energy. So, in fact, it is like this, that if you plot as a function of energy transfer, then you have the elastic scattering at omega equal to 0. You may have a Lorentzian distribution around the elastic point, and the width of this Lorentzian distribution is related to the relaxation time of the stochastic dynamics, diffusion or whatever you have. We will go into more details of that. And then you have delta functions on both sides of the energy transfer, at the positive energy transfer or negative energy transfer, very similar to the Stokes and anti-Stokes peaks you have in Raman scattering. So these are the excitations. The width is shown because of the instrumental resolution, but essentially these are delta functions which may have a width, inherent width as well. And so these are the excitation peaks, and this is the peak, the broad Lorentzian peak due to the quasi-elastic scattering coming from the stochastic dynamics. Okay, we also noticed that typically the thermal excitations we talk about, they are in the range of tens of milli-electron volts, typically from 0 to 200 or so, which depends on the strength of the interatomic bonding. And the stochastic dynamics, again, this depends on the kind of relaxation times that we are interested in. So typically relaxation times, for example, atomic jumps in solids due to diffusion, they are in the range of a few picoseconds, could be fraction of a picosecond to several picoseconds. And this can be expressed Okay, so this was the energy scale we mentioned that if, for example, there is a relaxation time of 1 picosecond, it translates into the a half width at half maximum of Lorentzian of about 0.6 millielectron volt. On the other hand, if you have excitations with a time period of about, let's say, a picosecond or a frequency of a terahertz, then the corresponding energies are about 4 millielectron volts, or in terms of centimeter inverse, 33 centimeter inverse. Okay. Now, because we have a range of these requirements of the energy transfer and the resolution and so on, there are a large number of spectrometers which cater to these different requirements. Okay, so now we'll move on to the today's lecture. So as we said, the energy scale involved in this inelastic scattering and quasi-elastic neutron scattering are in this range, about 200 millivolts in case of inelastic scattering, starting from 0 for, let's say, the acoustic phonon modes, to these are the stretching modes of, say, carbon-carbon or carbon-hydrogen and so on. And inelastic, quasi-elastic scattering typically in this range. So there are a variety of spectrometers because they require different energy ranges, different resolutions, and so on. Now, so typically there are two types. This I think you already studied in the previous lectures. You can measure the neutron energies by a crystal monochromator through the Bragg reflection. So if you have a Bragg reflection satisfied, you can identify what is the wavelength of the neutron that is reflected. And other is the neutron time of flight, where you essentially measure the flight time over a certain length. No, let me say that the velocity of neutron is about a kilometer per second. So therefore one had flight times which are in milliseconds or fraction of a milliseconds, which is quite comfortable. So you don't need a very high-end electronics measuring nanoseconds, but microseconds onwards are good enough. Backscattering spectrometers again are based on crystal monochromator, but this is when the Bragg angle is close to 90 degrees, and so then one gets an extremely high resolution. Another technique is neutron spinicospectrometer, which uses the neutron spin precision in a magnetic field of about a few hundred Gauss. And this again can give a very high energy resolution. Actually, it gives you a very high time resolution because of it's in real time one is measuring the precision, and the time resolution in the range of a microsecond to a nanosecond can be converted into corresponding energies and so on. So these are backscattering and neutron spin echo. These give resolution of around 0.001 millielectron volt, about a microelectron volt, whereas these techniques can give a resolution which is not as good as that, but better depending on the requirements. Okay. Now, let's just look at the first one, that is the triple axis spectrometer. Conceptually, what it has is the following. It's pretty simple. You have neutrons coming from the reactor. So it's a continuous beam of neutrons, but well, it doesn't have to be. You have a monochromator crystal, and you take a Bragg reflection. So depending on the Bragg angle, you can get a corresponding wavelength here. Okay, if the wavelength is lambda, the wave vector magnitude is 2 pi by lambda. Okay, this we have already seen. This falls onto a sample. Now, typically these distances are about, from the reactor to monochromator is typically a few meters, say 4 to 5 meters. Monochromator to sample again is about 1 or 2 meters. From sample, then again we have an analyzer, typically again a meter away, and this has a flexibility of going at any angle in the plane. And so there is another analyzer crystal, And once again, from the Bragg angle of the analyzer crystal, one can find out what is the wavelength of these neutrons which are scattered from the sample. And then you have a detector. Detector is typically a gas detector, either a helium-3 detector or a boron trifluoride BF3 detector. And these have fairly good efficiencies. And essentially, one can count each neutron that is falling here. So these are, what we actually measure is the number of neutrons over a finite time, maybe a few seconds to could be several minutes or half an hour or 1 hour or something. But you actually get the actual number of neutrons which are falling here. Okay. Construction-wise, these three different axes, namely the monochromator, sample, and analyzer, that is why it is called a triple axis. These are located in this manner. You have neutrons coming from the reactor. Then there is a large drum here which can rotate and such that you can extract neutrons at any specific Bragg angle within a range that is allowed by the construction. Why it is so large is because you need a large amount of shielding so that the background radiation outside is manageable, so that you can persons can actually work here. So although there is a large amount of radiation in the reactor and inside this drum, but outside one is something that is where human beings can go and work. So these neutrons come out through the shielding. Then at the sample, again you have a path from sample to analyzer, and then at the analyzer, again you reflect into a Bragg reflection and a detector. Okay, so there's a vector diagram here. Ki, that is the incident wave vector. Kf is the scattered wave vector from the sample, and the length of the line is proportional to the magnitude of the vector. So I can draw it like this, Ki and Kf. So this is Ki and that is Kf, and Ki minus Kf is equal to Q. So the Q is the wave vector transfer. So one is interested in the magnitude and direction of vector Q, and also the magnitude of the energy transfer. It is possible to do this. We'll go more into that, more detail into that. But these experiments are done in such a way that quite often you work in two modes: either a constant Q, that a constant vector Q, or a constant energy transfer, so that you keep one thing constant and then you can scan the other parameter. So in fact, this is a four-dimensional space of Q and E. So quite often we would keep three of them constant in some way, and we can scan along the fourth one. But of course, that is not absolutely essential. You can work in any arbitrary path in the Q omega space. Okay, this is an actual photograph of the triple axis neutron spectrometer at the Dhruva thermal neutron reactor in Trombay at the Bhabha Atomic Research Center. This is quite an old machine, almost working for last 30 years. So it has a monochromator crystal, which is copper, and the Bragg reflection plane that one uses is the 111 plane. The analyzer crystal is a pyrolytic graphite crystal, and again it's in 002 plane. Now these have been selected so that one can work with energy transfers of up to about 100 millielectron volts, and the resolution is of the order of 10 to 20%. So you get a resolution of, I would say, 10 millivolts or better than that sometimes. But you can get a very good resolution if you choose a smaller incident energy here. So we can get a resolution of as good as 2 millielectron volts at low energy transfers to higher values at high energy transfers. The scattering angles up to around 100 degrees are possible. So certain values of the wave vector transfer are possible here. More recently, the monochromator crystal here. Earlier it was a flat crystal, then it has been replaced by a double focusing crystal of certain kind, and that there's a technology that allows you to get large intensity without loss in resolution, what is called monochromatic focusing, but we will not go into details of these aspects here. So as I said, that machine is about 30 years old. Now a new spectrometer is being planned. I guess the funding has been received, but the actual construction is yet to take place. And this will have a larger flexibility and also better monochromator and analyzer crystals in such a way that you can work with even smaller samples and get a better signal to noise ratio. So this is again the monochromator drum. We call it monochromator drum. It's essentially the monochromator housing, but which allows the rotations of the monochromator crystal as well as positioning of the outgoing beam, neutron beam, at over a range of angles. And then you have this a sample table, which is just outside this. Then you have an analyzer table and a detector table. Okay, this other technique, neutron time-of-flight spectrometer. In fact, long time back, we did have a time-of-flight spectrometer in another reactor, that is a CIRUS reactor in Trombay, which is now closed. But at the Dhruva reactor, a new time-of-flight spectrometer is being built. It's at an advanced stage. And here, well, the concept in general is the following. In the time-of-flight spectrometer, again, there are two sides. You have a sample in the middle, and before the sample, between the reactor and the sample, you need some method to get a monochromatic beam of neutrons. So you could have again a monochromator crystal, or you use a set of rotors and choppers and whatnot to ensure that neutrons travel a definite distance in a given time. And if that is ensured, then that means the corresponding neutron velocity or neutron energy is defined. And given the direction, now you have all the variables. On the scattering side, from the sample we have here in the time-of-flight spectrometer, you wish to cover a large range of the solid angle, and therefore detectors, a large number of detectors are placed over a large semicircle. These are vertical detectors, position sensitive type of detectors. And this flight path is measured. You can pulse, you have to pulse the beam. So you start with, you have a pulsing system, and then from that point to the detector, you can measure the actual neutron time of flight and determine its energy. So you have a selection of the incident energy, and then you do energy analysis from using the neutron time of flight from the sample to the detectors. Okay, these are the components. Like you have, so here a major thing is that you need a large detector box with a large number of detectors from the sample. Okay, this is, in this particular case, one has a monochromator drum very similar to that in the triple axis spectrometer. But then you have a mechanism of pulsing the beam. Then at the sample table, and then from the sample table, you have a detector chamber, which allows to measure the neutrons over a range of the solid angle, and also allows to determine the neutron time of flight. There's a special equipment called the Fermi chopper, which essentially allows pulsing of the beam as well as fine-tuning the energy resolution. So you have now the energy resolution would be roughly twice better than that one has in the triple X spectrometer. Okay, so if we just broadly look at the comparison between the two techniques, triple X spectrometer, here the resolution is controlled by the choice of monochromator and analyzer crystals and the corresponding Bragg angles. But in this space, Q omega space, the actual scanning is done point-wise. So every step in the scan gives you 1 point in the Q omega space. But then this can be chosen all independently, and then one can find out how the spectrum is in this case. This is best for measurements using single crystals, where it is important to identify the values specifically. Neutron time-of-flight technique, on the other hand, the resolution is controlled by the neutron pulse width and flight paths. Here, instead of in place of a point-wise scan, you have a large range of Q and omega space is scanned in a single run. So you don't nothing. The detector side, nothing is moving, and you just collect data for a reasonable amount of time, maybe a few hours. And because of that, the Q and omega, there are some relations, but well, this is quite okay. And these techniques are usually best used for polycrystalline samples, where one needs really the overall picture in the Q omega space. However, single crystal experiments can also be done by taking data suitably out of this the range of Q and omega. Okay, incidentally, I think I have not got any questions from the previous lecture as well as, so I think it would be nice if you send your doubts or questions, anything by the method that you have been told, and so that we can actually discuss it and it can benefit everybody, including those who have not asked the questions. Now, let's move over to the concepts again. Well, in your basics, you would have already learned that there are two kinds of scattering in case of neutron scattering, what we call the coherent and incoherent scattering. And that occurs because the individual atoms from which the scattering takes place, the nuclei in particular, they have various spin states because, okay, the nucleus has a magnetic moment, and the scattering of the neutron with nucleus, being it's a nuclear process, it depends on the nuclear magnetic states. So depending on what the magnetic moment is, it's 2J plus 1 states are possible, and each of those has a different scattering length. Similarly, in a solid, there are various isotopes and with the different concentrations. And for a given atom, we don't know that there is a distribution of the spin states as well as a distribution of isotopes depending on their occupancies. So, so this is kind of a disorder. No, so the kind of disorder you have at every atomic site, that gives some statistical distribution of the scattering length. So if I take the average over all this, then this is called the coherent scattering length. And if I look at the variations in these values from these two types, then the variation is a measure, which is a measure of the statistical variation in the scattering length, is called the incoherent scattering length. And in fact, you would notice that if I take if I add the two, square of the coherent square and incoherent square, then the coherent square scattering length is the average B. Okay, and the individual atoms values are B, and so the total cross section is actually sum over the average of the B squares, and this has two parts: the coherent component and the incoherent component. Now, why do we talk like this? I mean, see, clearly, what really happens is that the coherent scattering, that is what means the average value over this statistical distribution, that average value is the same for all the atoms that are present, or the kind of atoms that are present in the solid at different lattice sites, and therefore the interference does occur between the neutron waves that are coherently scattered by various atoms. So because of this interference, this gives us information about the structure or the collective dynamics of different atoms, and which obviously, given the interference pattern, it depends on the wave vector transfer. For example, in case of the Bragg reflections or the diffraction, we know that the interference gives rise to the Bragg condition. Whereas on the other hand, the remaining part of the scattering, which is not from the coherent scattering, but the incoherent scattering, that also occurs. And that scattering occurs again from all the atoms, but that part of the scattering cannot interfere because it doesn't have any phase relationship. Okay, the reason is that because you never know how it has happened, from which isotope or which spin state it has occurred. And therefore, the incoherent scattering interference doesn't occur between the neutron waves that are incoherently scattered by various atoms. But all the same, this scattering is there. So this will not give information about the structure or collective dynamics, but this serves as some kind of it's not exactly background, because this also has variations with the wave vector and energy. But what does it, let's see what it can give. So you can look at single atom dynamics, because then you don't depend on the interference. But what is for example, the frequency spectrum of each atom, that can be determined by inelastic scattering arising from the incoherent scattering. So whatever incoherent scattering is taking place, if the energy analysis of the beam is done, then the corresponding spectrum will give us the single atom dynamics. For example, the vibrational spectrum, or the diffusion, the stochastic dynamics. So stochastic dynamics, again, because it's a diffusion of a given atom. So it's the same atom which is diffusing as a function of time. And once that is the case, then incoherent scattering very much has signature from these entities. So the scattering due to diffusion depends on Q, because there is certain geometry of the diffusion. However, the scattering due to vibrational spectrum, it doesn't have the same kind of Q dependence. It has certain Q dependence we will come to, but then largely there is no significant Q dependence because you're focusing attention on a given atom. A Q dependence comes because of the amplitude of so there is a certain geometry involved even with the vibrations, because there are finite amplitudes of the vibrations. Okay, you would have already heard of Debye-Euler factor. We'll see that. Okay, so these are the two features. Okay, now let's say, how do we exploit all that? I mean, see, these two kinds of things. Interference occurring between different atoms, and no interference, or the single atom scattering. So as we discussed the other day, the scattering is proportional to the dynamical structure factor, and the dynamical structure factor, which is S of Q and omega, in the reciprocal space. In the Q is a vector in the reciprocal space, and omega is again also in the reciprocal of time. So in the four-dimensional reciprocal space, the S of q omega is a Fourier transform of the position time correlation function. So these are way back in 1954. Van Have had worked out the theory of neutron scattering and introduced what are now known as Van Have correlation functions. So one can think of two types of the position time correlation function. One is the self part, that is the probability of finding a particle at, let's say, at a vector distance r at time t, given that the same particle was present at r equal to 0 and t equal to 0. So this just shows how the particle's position and time evolves and so that is called the self space-time correlation function. And as you could notice, this quantity would be related to the incoherent scattering. On the other hand, there is also a distinct part of the correlation function, that is the probability of finding a particle at vector r at time t, given that some other particle was present at r equal to 0 at t equal to 0. So what it means is if one atom particle is present at the, say, origin at time t equal to 0, and then how the positions of all other particles evolves with in space and time, either because of vibrational or periodic dynamics or stochastic dynamics or what have you. But now, to the extent that these are two different particles, so then it is a distinct correlation function, and you can well imagine that this would be related to the coherent scattering. In fact, I should say that this one is also related to the coherent scattering as well as incoherent scattering, because even though it's the same particle or atom, it has both coherent and incoherent scattering. So both of them will contribute to this, whereas only the coherent part of the scattering will contribute to the distinct correlation function. So these are formal definitions. If we look at now the okay, so we said, that if we have the self correlation function and we take the Fourier transform of it, then the Fourier transform, so Fourier transform means only the R is Fourier transformed to Q from the real space to reciprocal space. And so the probabilities which were written in terms of delta function. So these are just exponential IQ dot R of Ri of t and exponential minus IQ R. Okay, you have I of t because it's the same atom involved. So atom I, position of atom I at time t equal to 0, and position of atom I at time t, the same atom, and so this is the quantity that is called and this is the suitable average over the number of particles we have, and also over the time differences. You can choose your origin at any time. So the time difference 0 to t, that is relevant. So this is called the incoherent intermediate scattering function. Intermediate because we have done Fourier transform only over one variable. Then we have this another function that is a distinct correlation function. So it's a similar function, except that we have now two different atoms, Ri of t, that is the atom I at time t, and given that an atom J was there at time t equal to 0. So again, these are the two position coordinates. And so this gives a distinct correlation function. Okay, called the coherent intermediate scattering function. Now, if you do a further Fourier transform from of this quantity, incoherent intermediate scattering function from T to omega, then that becomes the incoherent scattering law. And similarly, if we take a Fourier transform of the distinct space-time correlation function, which gives the coherent intermediate scattering function, then the Fourier transform of that quantity gives the coherent scattering law. So as I said, both of these functions have relevance with the in both neutron inelastic as well as the quasi-elastic scattering. Okay. Now, I'm not sure whether you have really got it all right, but just to recall what we have done is that you have, just let me recall it here. You have the two kinds of scattering, one which is capable of interference between the waves scattered by different atoms, and the other which is not capable of interference. So where these will be all coming from each atom will be summed together, and you measure that in the detector. Whereas this gives a diffraction pattern or like at selective values of the selective directions. Okay, that we mentioned. And then these are related to the two different correlation functions, either self or distinct. And you have the two scattering laws. So this coming from the Fourier transform of the self correlation function, so which gives the incoherent scattering. This gives from the Fourier transform of the distinct correlation function. But as I said, here, although we have written it like this, but even the same atom also gives coherent scattering, and therefore in the distinct part, we will include the same atom also. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that this is only for the self part, but when we get the coherent scattering, we get coherent scattering from both of these functions. Okay. Now let's look at some numbers. We have the let's say what are the kind of cross sections from the coherent scattering and incoherent scattering we have from various atoms. So actually there is a very broad range of values of the coherent and incoherent scattering cross sections for various atoms, and these are typical examples. Say hydrogen and deuterium, these are two different isotopes. So the hydrogen isotope has a scattering length. Okay, it happens to be negative. I'm sure you learned that the scattering length can be both positive and negative, and to that extent, the values when the interference takes place, the positive and negative values coming from different atoms may cancel out each other. So there are certain compounds which may not have any coherent scattering, but the coherent scattering gets cancelled out for certain cases. On the other hand, but if you take a specific isotope, then it has a coherent scattering length which is 1.8 barn, which is this is the scattering cross section of 4 pi times b square, and the barn is 10 to the power minus 24 centimeter square. But here the incoherent part is extremely large. This is against 1.8, this is about 80. And so you can say that this is roughly more than 40 times bigger. This is the absorption cross-section, which is negligible compared to these numbers. Then you have deuterium. Deuterium has a positive scattering length, which is roughly double of the in magnitude. The coherent scattering cross section is 5.6 barns, and the incoherent scattering cross section for deuterium is as low as 2. So here, then that means it is largely coherent scattering and very small incoherent scattering. This contrast is heavily used in, for example, small angle neutron scattering or something, but that will come to later. But here, what is relevant here is that hydrogen has a large incoherent scattering cross section, which means it has remember we just said that if you look at the diffusion of a single atom as it diffuses, it essentially gives you incoherent scattering, although it also gives you coherent scattering. But if the incoherent scattering is very large, then you can look at the you can get the information about the diffusion from this particular atom, and therefore this property is used to determine the diffusion involving hydrogen atoms or even molecules containing hydrogen atoms, and it gives a very good scattering cross section for to study the stochastic dynamics of the systems. On the other hand, even for the vibrational spectrum also, if the system, if the compound or the sample has hydrogen, then it will dominate the total scattering, and you will end up getting information largely from the hydrogen atom. Okay. On the other hand, if you are interested in the interparticle or collective dynamics, and then one should really avoid the isotopes which have large incoherent scattering, and so often you need to deuterate the sample if you're interested in the collective dynamics of the corresponding molecules. In comparison to these numbers, say nitrogen, again here I have averaged over all the isotopes of nitrogen. Here there is no averaging. If you take the ordinary water, then you need to average the, but again it has largely it has got the hydrogen isotopes and a very small fraction of deuterium, and therefore the scattering still is largely because of the hydrogen. Nitrogen has a small incoherent scattering cross section and a fairly large coherent scattering cross section. Oxygen on the other hand has a value of the coherent cross section, but practically zero incoherent scattering, because this has there are no, I mean, almost no other isotopes, or other isotopes have a very negligible occupancy, and also the nuclear spin is such that you will not get the variations. So there is no nuclear spin for this one, oxygen. Okay. So let's see whether we need to revise something, because I don't want to go now more into the basic concepts. What we have done so far is general ideas about inelastic and quasi-elastic scattering, coherent and incoherent scattering, also the kind of instrumentation one has. So now in the next lecture, we will now go into the introduction being more or less over. We will go into specifics. For example, how do we measure the phonon dispersion relation or the phonon density of states or the magnetic excitations using single crystals or polycrystalline samples, or if you have amorphous structures. So from various kinds of structural structures, how do we measure this? And in particular, if you're interested in phonon dispersion relation, then you need to measure specific excitations at a definite wave vector and energy. So how are these selectively probed? So that would be a few lectures. We will also go into a little bit about the theory of phonons or lattice dynamics. Then another set of lectures, a few lectures will be on the stochastic dynamics. Okay, we said here diffusion in a very general sense. What we really mean is stochastic dynamics involving translations of individual atoms or translation and rotation or reorientations of molecules. Okay, so given the, which is stochastic in nature. And given that these systems tend to be of fairly complex structures involving several atoms, the data analysis or even planning of the experiment is not straightforward, but it heavily depends on some kind of a modeling or simulation. So you need to anticipate what we are going to observe or what we are likely to observe, and how to distinguish between what are the different possibilities, and then identify. There are also issues of the resolutions of the instruments, which you need to, as I said, the energy ranges as well as the resolutions, and therefore which instruments to select to study these one of these physics aspects. Again, we will look at that. Okay. Let's see whether something more can be said. At some stage, I'll give some assignments. So what I would like you to know is the simple concepts and also some numbers. For example, given the wavelength, how do you get the energies and what are the values like? One can actually derive it. This you would have already done. But in the context of inelastic scattering, namely, yes. So, yeah, for example, these kind of relations, that if you have certain period of oscillation, then what are the corresponding values of the energies in different units? And the energy is known to be h cross omega or h nu, but once you put the numbers in, what are the corresponding values of the energies in the different units like millivolts or centimeter inverse? You can work it out. And so also if you have a exponential relaxation, this is a very simple term. Actual relaxation may or may not be a single exponential function. It can be a combination of several exponential functions, just as you have several oscillators in a periodic dynamics. You may have several exponential relaxations corresponding to different aspects of the stochastic dynamics and with different weighting factors. And so, but if you have a given one, then how its Fourier transform will give you a Lorentzian distribution, and you can try to work out if you have a relaxation function with a time constant of 1 picosecond, and if you do a Fourier transform, then what is the half fit at half maximum of the Lorentzian function? So this you could work it out. Okay. Then yes. Let's just look at this. How do we get a very high energy resolution in the backscattering spectrometer? So, very good. So, you know, we have these Bragg relations. So now let me just differentiate it. So, ln of lambda will be equal to ln of sine theta plus ln of 2d. Okay. So if I just differentiate it now, it is d lambda over lambda will be equal to one by sine theta into cos theta d theta. Okay, and that is 0 because that is a fixed wavelength. So this is equal to cot theta d theta. So now you just think of it. So this would have been done earlier? No. Okay. Good. So now you see, think of it. If your theta is around 90 degrees, then cot theta becomes 0. So therefore, you can get an extremely high resolution. Okay, but you're not really at 0, and therefore, in fact, if you're close to 90 degree, then cos theta is 1, and therefore this becomes roughly d theta divided by sin theta. No, sorry, it's the other way. Cos theta is, sin theta is close to 1, and it is cos theta, sin theta is close to 1. So it's, so now, can use the eraser.
Top right.
This one? Yeah, okay.
Small eraser. Any small eraser.
Okay, good. Anyway, so the point is that yeah, if your theta is, let's say, about 1 degree away from, so let's say it is 89 degrees. So if it is 89 degrees, then sin theta is almost 1, and so cos theta will be like about 90 minus theta. Oh, sorry. Okay, 5. I mean, this would be a small number. Okay, you can work it out. So what it happens is that you can get an extremely high resolution at in the backscattering geometry, and that is the essential concept used in the backscattering spectrometer. In fact, it is the same concept we use in general in the triple axis spectrometer, because we can choose. We have a variety of monochromators, as I said, copper or pyrolytic graphite or germanium, silicon, and so on and so forth. The reason we use different ones is that, okay, one thing, they have a slightly different, somewhat different scattering length, but more important, the d spacings are different in those crystals, and therefore you can get the same wavelength at different values of the Bragg angle, and depending on the Bragg angle, your resolutions are different. So, for example, copper gives a much better resolution than graphite. So that's the way we select the monochromators. So what we learned is that with the crystal monochromator, we can use a variety of crystals, typically copper. But here again, there are different planes possible, like 001 or 002 and something. 002 is normally not used, but okay, so maybe 110 or whatever. Okay, so these will give the same wavelength at different theta, and therefore different resolutions. Okay, this is one aspect, and also the energy range that you can get again is there's a variety. So this is one concept one can use. Okay, now let me just go back to the right.
We'll keep it in the corner. Yes.
Okay. Fine. I think let me try to close here. So as I said, we will. I'll take off from these diagrams to study the phonon dispersion curves, and also we will try to calculate quantities corresponding to the scattering law. I think that's about it. Yeah. Fine. Thank you. See you again day after tomorrow. Okay, sir. Distinct part corresponds to motion of particles. So then, okay, very good. So I think it's a very, very good question. So let me repeat. Okay, so this is how we defined our correlation function. So now you can see that the self part corresponds to the motion of the same particle as a function of time. Okay, whereas distinct part corresponds to motion between two different particles. Okay, so that means this is collective dynamics. This is collective dynamics. This is single particle dynamics. When the same particle, for example, the same particle vibrating in a periodic dynamics or the same particle diffusing in a stochastic dynamics, that will correspond to the self part. And it's a collective dynamics involving more than one atom, let's say a phonon propagating in which various atoms participate, or when there is a correlated diffusion, when, for example, when one atom is diffusing, it somehow affects the dynamics of another atom, then that will be the diffusion. Okay, so Guy, you got it. Thank you.